The ultimatum. What happens when the most ruthless woman on Wall Street is forced to trade her empire for a husband she considers beneath her, only to discover that the quiet, grease-stained man sleeping in her East Wing is the single most dangerous financial predator on the planet? Chloe Sterling didn't build her empire by being kind. She built it by being right, faster, sharper, and colder than every man who ever underestimated her. But no amount of intelligence prepares you for the moment you realize the charity case you married out of desperation has been running the entire world from your kitchen counter. This is that story. The boardroom of Sterling Global occupied the entire 34th floor of the Sterling Tower, a glass fortress suspended above Manhattan like a crown. At precisely 7:47 a.m., 13 executives sat in tense silence around a mahogany table the length of a bowling lane. At the head of that table sat Chloe Sterling. She was 32 years old, the youngest female CEO in Fortune 500 history. She wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit with a single strand of Japanese Akoya pearls, her mother's, the only soft thing about her. Her icy blue eyes moved across the quarterly projections without blinking, dissecting numbers the way a surgeon dissects tissue, cleanly, without sentiment. "Richard Caldwell has accelerated his proxy campaign," said Marcus Webb, her CFO, sliding a dossier across the polished table. His hands were trembling slightly. "He's now holding 22% of our outstanding shares through Shell intermediaries. If he reaches 26% before our European merger closes, he can force a board vote. We'd lose the room, Chloe, possibly within 60 days. The room held its breath. Chloe set down her pen. She looked at Marcus the way a chess grandmaster looks at an opponent who just made a predictable move. "Pull the trigger on the Midwest asset liquidation. All 4 distribution centers. List them Friday. Use the proceeds to execute a share buyback. I want our float reduced by 15% before Caldwell's next filing deadline." She stood, buttoning her jacket. "And tell our legal team to audit every single proxy vote he's collected. Richard Caldwell didn't build his fortune by playing clean. Find the dirt." She adjourned the meeting without ceremony, leaving 13 executives scrambling for their phones. The moment the heavy glass doors sealed behind her, her personal cell buzzed. "Private number. 2 words as caller ID, grandfather." She answered before the second ring. "My office." Arthur Sterling's voice was like gravel dragged across sandpaper. "Now. And don't keep me waiting, Chloe. I'm 81 years old. Every minute counts." Arthur Sterling's private study on the 40th floor was a different world from the surgical modernity of the boardroom below. Dark mahogany paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves holding first editions no one had read in decades. The permanent ghost of Cuban cigar smoke embedded in the Persian rug. An oxygen tank hummed quietly beside his wingback chair like a loyal companion. The old man looked diminished, his hands spotted with age, his frame sunken into the leather. But his eyes, the same impossible blue as Chloe's, burned with an authority that made her feel 16 years old every single time she walked through that door. "Sit down," he rasped. "I have 3 conference calls in 40 minutes, grandfather. Whatever this is." "Ooh!" "Sit down." She sat. Arthur studied her for a long moment, the precise way he used to study contracts before signing them. Looking for the weakness, looking for the clause that would cost him. "You're going to lose the company," he said. Not as a prediction, as a verdict. Chloe's jaw tightened. "I have it under control. You have Caldwell closing in from the outside and a board that's losing its nerve on the inside. That's not control. That's a siege." He reached forward, lifting a manila envelope from his desk. "I hold 51% of the voting shares in the Sterling Family Trust. I have held them for 31 years. I have protected this company through 3 recessions and 1 near-criminal investigation that we will never speak of again." Chloe said nothing. "I am prepared to transfer those shares to you, full controlling interest. The company becomes untouchable. Caldwell, the board, all of it becomes irrelevant." He paused. "On one condition." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, 26 years ago, Arthur continued, his voice quieting. I drove off Mulholland Drive in a rainstorm. I was drunk. I'm not proud of it. My car went over the embankment and caught fire. A man named Jonathan Cross was driving home from a night shift at a construction site. He saw the accident. He pulled me out of that burning wreck with his bare hands. Arthur looked down at his own hands. He had third-degree burns on both palms. He spent 6 weeks in hospital. I tried to give him $2 million. He refused. Said he didn't do it for money. Said any decent man would have done the same. A long silence. Jonathan Cross died 14 months ago. Scaffolding collapse in the Bronx. Arthur's voice was measured, but something underneath it was not. He left behind a son, Nathaniel, and a 6-year-old granddaughter named Lily. They are currently living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. The son works as a mechanic. He is 29 months behind on rent. Chloe stared at her grandfather. A cold, creeping dread moved through her. No, she said. You will marry Nathaniel Cross. Arthur's voice was utterly calm. You will bring him and his daughter into the Sterling household. You will give them the protection of this family's name, its security, and its resources. In return, I transfer the trust. Grandfather. Chloe stood slowly, her voice dropping to a register she used when she needed people to understand she was not negotiating. What you are describing is corporate suicide. The press will eviscerate us. The board will question my judgment. Our institutional investors will marry him by Friday, Arthur said, lifting the manila envelope and placing it on the edge of the desk. Or I sell my 51% to Richard Caldwell. I've already had preliminary conversations with his team. The room was absolutely silent, except for the quiet hum of the oxygen machine. Chloe looked at the envelope, then at the old man in the chair. She looked for a bluff in those blue eyes. The same way she'd been looking for bluffs in boardrooms for 10 years. She found nothing, only resolution. And buried beneath it, something that looked almost like grief. The walls of her empire pressed inward. She had given everything to Sterling Global. 11 years of 18-hour days, sacrificed relationships, sacrificed sleep, sacrificed the version of herself that might have wanted something gentler. She had bled for this company. It belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with legal documents. She would not hand it to Richard Caldwell. Fine, she said. The word came out barely above a whisper, wrapped in quiet fury. She picked up the envelope. Where is he? Arthur Sterling leaned back in his chair. For just a moment, one brief, almost imperceptible moment, something crossed his weathered face that wasn't regret and wasn't satisfaction. It looked impossibly like relief. Queens, he said. Apartment 3B, his name is on the door. The mechanic. The black Maybach moved through Queens like a surgical instrument inserted into the wrong body. Chloe sat in the back seat, the manila envelope on her lap, watching the neighborhood transform block by block, from the glass and steel of Manhattan to something rawer, older, more honest. Laundromats with hand-painted signs. Bodegas with metal grates half-drawn. Children on stoops doing homework in the last of the afternoon light. Her bodyguard Davis drove in silence, reading her mood with the expertise of a man who had worked for her for 6 years and understood that certain silences were not to be interrupted. She told herself this was a transaction, a temporary inconvenience. She had navigated hostile takeovers, congressional investigations, and one extraordinarily unpleasant divorce deposition for a board member she'd rather forget. She could navigate a contractual marriage to a mechanic from Queens. She told herself that the entire way there. The building at 1147 Crescent Avenue was 5 stories of crumbling red brick held together by habit and stubborn structural memory. The intercom panel in the lobby had 12 buttons, and 11 of them were broken. Davis held the door. Chloe stepped inside, her Louboutins clicking against a checkerboard tile floor that hadn't been waxed since the Clinton administration. The elevator was out of service. A handwritten sign on yellow paper said so, with a cheerfulness that Chloe found personally offensive. She climbed 3 flights. The stairwell smelled of boiled vegetables and someone's laundry. On the second-floor landing, 2 small boys were playing cards. They stopped and stared at her with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of children who had never seen anyone dressed like that in their building. She realized with a strange pang she couldn't name, entirely out of place here, not just visually, something deeper, like a musical note played in the wrong key. Apartment 3B had a small brass number, and below it, taped with a piece of packing tape, a hand-drawn crayon picture of what appeared to be a rabbit wearing a crown. Chloe raised her hand and knocked. She expected to wait. Instead, the door opened in 4 seconds, as if someone had been standing just behind it, not quite ready, but not surprised either. Nathaniel Cross was not what she expected. She had constructed a mental image on the drive over, someone small in ambition and stature, visibly worn by poverty, possibly apologetic in posture. The kind of person who flinches when a billionaire walks into the room. Nathaniel Cross did not flinch. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the door frame without effort. He wore a faded gray Henley pushed up to the elbows and dark work denim that had been washed so many times the color had migrated from black to something closer to memory. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he hadn't thought about it. His hands, resting against the doorframe, were large and calloused and stained faintly with engine grease along the knuckle creases. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Deep-set, startlingly green, the color of still water over dark stone, and calm. Not the manufactured calm of someone suppressing anxiety. Something else entirely. Something that Chloe, who made her living reading people, could not immediately classify. She filed it away. "Ms. Sterling," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, a baritone that seemed to come from somewhere settled rather than somewhere performing. "I was told to expect you." Before Chloe could respond, a small figure materialized behind his left leg like a specter in pigtails. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, with her father's green eyes and a gap-toothed smile that took up most of her face. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing and regarding Chloe with the kind of frank, unfiltered assessment that only children and very experienced negotiators can deliver. "Daddy," the girl said, without lowering her voice or adjusting for the presence of a stranger. "She looks like the lady on the building." "What building, Bug?" "The tall, shiny one, the picture on the side." Nathaniel looked at Chloe with something that might, in another context, have been amusement. He gently steered the girl back with one hand. "Lily, cartoons. Give me 20 minutes. Is she staying for dinner?" "20 minutes, Lily." The girl disappeared, though Chloe had the distinct impression she hadn't gone far. Nathaniel stepped back from the door, not an invitation exactly, more an absence of obstruction, and Chloe entered. The apartment was small. That was the first and most obvious fact. The living room, kitchen, and dining area occupied a single space that would have fit inside Chloe's walk-in wardrobe. The furniture was mismatched and clearly thrifted. A blue sofa with a repaired armrest, a wooden kitchen table with 4 chairs of 3 different designs, a bookshelf improvised from planks and stacked milk crates, filled with children's books and what appeared to be academic texts on mechanical engineering. But the apartment was clean. Not just tidy, genuinely, carefully clean, in the way that costs effort rather than money. The floors were swept. The windows were clear. A small vase on the kitchen table held 3 yellow wildflowers and fresh water. Chloe had been in penthouses worth $40 million that felt less lived in than this. She dismissed the observation and opened the envelope. "I'll make this efficient," she said, keeping her voice in its boardroom register. "My grandfather has outlined the arrangement. I've had my legal team prepare a comprehensive prenuptial agreement." She set the document on the kitchen table, 52 pages, tabbed and flagged. The key terms. The marriage is contractual and will be maintained publicly for a minimum of 2 years. You and your daughter will be relocated to my penthouse on Central Park West. You will receive a monthly stipend of $75,000. Your daughter will be enrolled in the Whitmore Academy beginning next semester. It has a 7-year waiting list. That waiting list no longer applies. In exchange, you pose as my husband at required public functions. You do not speak to the press without prior approval from my communications director, and you do not interfere with my professional life in any capacity." She looked up. "Are there any questions?" Nathaniel had not sat down during this recitation. He stood with his arms crossed loosely, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching her with those unnervingly still green eyes. He looked at the 52-page document the way a man looks at something he already understands and is deciding whether to say so. "$75,000, he said, "per month." "Yes. And Lily gets the school." "Correct." A silence settled between them. From the other room came the muted sound of a cartoon, something with talking animals and cheerful background music that felt surreal against the weight of the conversation happening in the kitchen. Nathaniel looked past Chloe toward the sound. That flash crossed his face again, the one she'd caught in the doorway. Brief and dark and entirely out of register with everything else about him, like a crack in a wall that suggests something enormous pressing from the other side. "It was gone in under a second. One condition," he said quietly. Chloe raised an eyebrow. "The stipend, I don't want it deposited in my name. Open an account in Lily's name. An education trust. Everything goes there." He met her eyes. "I don't need your money, Ms. Sterling, but she's going to need more than a school." Chloe studied him for a moment longer than she intended to. "Done," she said. He picked up the pen she'd set beside the contract. He didn't read it, or rather, he read it in the way people read things they have already understood by other means. Quickly, with no surprise, turning pages with the calm efficiency of someone confirming rather than discovering. He signed on the final page without ceremony. Nathaniel Cross set the pen down and looked at her. "Friday then," he said. "Friday," Chloe confirmed. She gathered the contract, straightened her jacket, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct, some frequency she couldn't name. She turned back. Nathaniel hadn't moved. He was looking at the table where the document had been. Not at her, not at anything in particular. His expression was composed and unreadable, but his right hand, resting on the kitchen counter, was pressed flat against the surface with a stillness that was not relaxed. It was controlled. Chloe filed that away too and left. Ghost marriage. The wedding took place on a Friday morning at the Manhattan Civil Court on Center Street. It lasted 9 minutes. Chloe wore a white wool Loro Piana blazer and matching trousers. Professional, precise, and entirely devoid of romance. Nathaniel wore a navy suit that fit him well enough to suggest it wasn't rented, though Chloe had assumed it was. The only witnesses were Arthur's senior attorney, a paralegal named Christine, who kept checking her phone, and Lily, who wore a yellow dress with a sash she had tied herself and carried her one-eared rabbit as a bouquet replacement with complete sincerity. When the clerk pronounced them married, Lily clapped. Nathaniel looked at Chloe. She looked at him. Neither of them smiled, but he offered his hand, not romantically, just a clean, straightforward gesture, the way you'd acknowledge a business partner after closing a difficult deal, and she shook it. His grip was firm and brief and told her absolutely nothing. That evening, a single moving truck arrived at the Central Park West penthouse. Chloe had expected more. The entirety of Nathaniel and Lily's possessions filled 43 boxes, most of them Lily's. Nathaniel carried them up himself, refusing the building's porter service with a polite but final, "We're fine, thank you." That did not invite further discussion. Chloe gave them the East Wing, 2 bedrooms, a shared bathroom, a sitting room with park views that her interior designer had spent 11 weeks curating and which Lily immediately decorated with crayon drawings taped directly to the wallpaper. Chloe did not say anything about the wallpaper. She was not entirely sure why. The rules were established that first evening, delivered by Chloe with the brisk efficiency of an employee orientation. West Wing was hers exclusively after 9 p.m. The kitchen was shared, but her private chef, Andre, prepared her meals on a separate schedule. The penthouse had 4 staff members, a housekeeper, a driver, a security coordinator, and Andre, all of whom reported ultimately to Chloe and were bound by NDAs of considerable legal weight. Any interaction with the press required 48 hours notice and written approval from her communications director. Public appearances were to be coordinated through her assistant, Rachel. Nathaniel listened to all of this standing in the kitchen doorway with Lily asleep against his shoulder, one small hand tangled in the collar of his shirt. He nodded at appropriate intervals. When Chloe finished, he said, "Understood. Thank you for the room." That was the most he said to her for the next 11 days. And they lived like parallel lines, sharing space without intersecting. Chloe left before 6 and rarely returned before 10. When she did come home, the penthouse was always quiet. Lily asleep, the kitchen tidied. Sometimes there was a covered plate on the counter with a post-it in Lily's handwriting. "We made pasta. There's extra." The spelling was creative. Chloe moved the plates to the refrigerator without eating from them. She told herself it was the carbs. She began to notice things. The $75,000 monthly transfer she made to Lily's education trust on the first of each month. Nathaniel had structured it correctly, confirmed with her accountant, and never touched the associated expense card she'd issued for his personal use. Not once. She checked the statements, 0 transactions. He still woke at 5 a.m. She knew because she was often still working at that hour and could hear, faintly, the sound of the kitchen. Quiet, deliberate movements. The specific percussion of someone making breakfast with focus rather than habit. By the time she emerged at 7, there was always fresh coffee in the pot. Not left for her specifically, she told herself, just made. He spent a significant portion of each day on the building's private terrace. She observed this from her office window. A large man sitting in a patio chair with what appeared to be a cheap smartphone and a worn leather notebook, writing things down in a hand too small and too precise to read from a distance. Once, she watched him for 4 minutes before catching herself and returning to her work with a focus that felt slightly manufactured. On the 12th day, everything shifted. Chloe came home at 6:30 p.m. Early by her standards, driven home by a migraine that had been building since noon and a piece of news that had arrived at 4 p.m. like a bullet. Omnicorp had pulled out of their Pacific supply chain agreement. Victor Harrison, the CEO, had cited strategic realignment. It had cost Sterling Global $340 million in projected quarterly revenue and sent their stock down 2.7% in after-hours trading. She walked into the kitchen and stopped. Andre was gone. His day off, she'd forgotten. Instead, Nathaniel stood at the 6-burner range in a plain black t-shirt, stirring something in a cast-iron pot, with the unhurried attention of a man who found cooking genuinely interesting rather than necessary. The kitchen smelled of roasted tomatoes and fresh basil, and something else underneath, garlic, browned in good olive oil, that was so entirely domestic it felt almost aggressive in its warmth. On the counter, a grilled cheese sandwich sat cut into precise triangles, crusts removed. Lily's. "Chef's day off," Nathaniel said without turning around. "There's tomato soup if you want some. Real tomatoes, not the can." "I don't eat after 6, Chloe said, setting her briefcase on the island with more force than she intended. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "Omnicorp pulled our supply chain contract today. Victor Harrison. You wouldn't know the name. Seattle branch?" Chloe looked up. Nathaniel was adjusting the flame beneath the pot. His back was still to her. "Yes," she said slowly. "The Seattle branch. Harrison has been in Caldwell's orbit for 18 months. We had a 10-year agreement and he walked away from it in a phone call." She heard the exhaustion in her own voice and disliked it. "It's a coordinated attack. Caldwell is picking apart our supply infrastructure before he moves on the shares." A pause. "Who sits on Omnicorp's audit committee?" Nathaniel asked, conversationally, the way someone asks about the weather. Chloe frowned. "Why does that matter?" "It probably doesn't," he said mildly. He lifted the ladle, tasted the soup, reached for the salt. Just curious how his board would respond if Harrison's personal liability exposure were to become a matter of public record. The sentence landed with a precision that was entirely at odds with the domestic scene surrounding it. Chloe stared at the back of his head. "Excuse me? The soup needs another few minutes." He set down the ladle, wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, and pulled the cheap smartphone from his pocket. "I need to call my buddy from the old garage. Check in." He moved toward the terrace, sliding the glass door open. "Help yourself to the soup. You look like you haven't eaten since this morning." The terrace door closed. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, Chloe watched him sit down in the patio chair. In the dark, with only the ambient light of the Manhattan skyline behind him, she saw something happen that she could not fully explain. His posture changed, not dramatically, not like a costume being removed, more like a frequency shifting, something dropping away from his bearing and something else rising to replace it. His spine straightened by a degree that was barely visible but completely altered the architecture of how he occupied the chair. His chin lifted slightly. The hand holding the phone stopped being casual. He sat like someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. He spoke for 4 minutes. She could see his lips moving but heard nothing through the triple-glazed glass. When he ended the call, he sat for a moment looking out at the city with an expression she would have needed to be closer to read. Then he stood, rolled his shoulders once, and walked back inside. "Garage is good," he said pleasantly, sliding the door shut behind him. He picked up the ladle. "Soup's ready." Chloe looked at him. He looked at the pot. She sat down at the kitchen island and, for the first time in 11 days, accepted the bowl he placed in front of her. She told herself it was only because she hadn't eaten since morning. She told herself she hadn't noticed anything unusual. She was, for the first time in a very long time, telling herself things she didn't entirely believe.
The call. The next morning, Chloe's phone rang at 5:47 a.m. She was already awake. Had been since 4, sitting at her desk in the West Wing with 3 monitors running and a cup of espresso she'd made herself, because she didn't want to walk past the kitchen and find Nathaniel already there, already calm, already making her feel like she was the strange one in her own home. It was Marcus Webb, her CFO. He never called before 7. In 6 years, he had called before 7 exactly twice. Once when their Singapore subsidiary caught fire, literally, and once when a board member was arrested at JFK with someone else's passport. She answered on the first ring. "Marcus, turn on Bloomberg." His voice had the quality of a man who had not slept and had recently received news that rearranged his understanding of the universe. "Right now, Chloe, turn it on." She reached for the remote. The screen filled with the pre-market ticker. And there, running in the red banner at the bottom of the frame with the particular urgency that financial news reserved for events that defied reasonable explanation. Breaking. Omnicorp reverses. Supply chain decision. Signs. Exclusive. 12-year agreement with Sterling Global. CEO Victor Harrison cites compelling strategic alignment. Omni stock up 4.1% pre-market. Chloe sat very still. 12 years, Marcus said. 12, Chloe. We had 10 before and he walked away from it. Now he's calling our VP of operations at midnight, offering 12 with a renegotiated rate structure that's 15% below what we were paying before. Harrison sounded. Marcus paused, searching for the word. Frightened. Chloe said nothing. "Do you know what happened?" "No," she said. She hung up. She sat in the blue pre-dawn light of her office, the Bloomberg ticker scrolling its impossible news across the screen, and she thought about a man sitting in a patio chair in the dark. About a posture that shifted like a frequency changing. About 4 minutes of silent conversation with a city skyline as backdrop. Corporate politics usually comes down to leverage. She put her espresso down and walked to her desk. She opened her secure communications channel and typed a single message to Donovan Croft, former MI6, currently the most discreet and effective corporate intelligence operative on the Eastern Seaboard. Full background, Nathaniel Cross, Queens, New York, mechanic. Everything you can find. She hit send. Then she went to make coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. Nathaniel was already in the kitchen. Of course he was. He was sitting on the floor, the actual floor, cross-legged on the heated marble, with Lily beside him, both of them in pajamas, working on what appeared to be an elaborate drawing of a castle populated entirely by rabbits in business suits. Lily was narrating the scene with considerable creative authority. Nathaniel was drawing the rabbits with a focused precision that suggested he was taking the assignment seriously. He looked up when Chloe entered. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's fresh?" He looked at her face for exactly 1 second longer than a casual glance. "Bloomberg had something interesting this morning?" "Yes," Chloe said carefully, moving to the coffee machine. "It did. Funny how these things turn around." He returned to the rabbit drawing. Lily added a hat to one of them, a top hat, rendered in orange crayon with architectural ambition. "Markets are unpredictable. Omnicorp's CEO called our operations team at midnight," Chloe said, keeping her voice neutral. She poured her coffee. "Personally, offering terms better than anything we'd previously negotiated. Victor Harrison, as of 36 hours ago, would not return my CFO's calls." Said Nathaniel. He shaded the castle turret. Chloe repeated. A silence that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely uncomfortable settled between them. Lily, oblivious to its texture, held up the drawing for her father's inspection. "Does the queen rabbit need a sword?" Lily asked. "Absolutely," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "Every queen needs a sword." Chloe picked up her coffee and returned to the West Wing without another word. Donovan Croft called back in 31 hours. Chloe was in her private sitting room, door closed, when the call came through on the encrypted line she'd set up specifically for his work. She answered it knowing, by the quality of the silence before he spoke, that whatever he'd found had unsettled him. Donovan Croft was not easily unsettled. He had, in his previous career, diffused a diplomatic incident in Tbilisi and extracted an asset from a Minsk safe house with a broken collarbone. He was not a man who frightened easily or spoke imprecisely. His voice, when it came, was doing both. "Chloe," a pause. "I need you to hear me clearly. Stop the search, right now. Delete the request from your system and don't ask anyone else to run this." She kept her voice steady. "What did you find?" "That's exactly the problem. Nothing. The social security number for Nathaniel Cross was issued 38 months ago. His employment records before that. The garage, the prior address, all of it. They're shells. Constructed shells, but constructed so well, they held up to a first pass." Another pause. Longer. "When I pushed deeper and tried to access military records through a DoD backdoor, I've used a dozen times. My server room went dark. Complete hard drive wipe. 60 seconds, Chloe. Every drive in the facility. I've been running intelligence operations for 19 years. That has never happened." Chloe's hand tightened on the phone. "The counter-intrusion protocol that hit me," Donovan continued, his voice dropping, "is not civilian architecture. It's not even standard government architecture. I've only seen that signature once before, during a NATO black budget audit that I was specifically told to stop pursuing." He exhaled. "Whoever built Nathaniel Cross's identity is operating at a level that makes people like me look like we're playing with toy trains." "Donovan, you are sleeping 40 feet away from someone who doesn't exist, Chloe. Someone who chose not to exist. And whoever they really are, they are extraordinary at keeping it that way." His voice dropped to something close to a whisper. "Walk away from this one. I'm serious. I have a daughter. I'm walking away from it. You should too." The line went dead. Chloe sat with the phone in her hand and the Central Park treetops visible through the window, bare and skeletal in the November cold, and she thought about everything she knew and everything she didn't. She thought about green eyes that didn't flinch, about a posture that shifted in the dark, about a man who didn't want $75,000 a month but specified exactly where it should go and how it should be structured, about a watch she hadn't looked at closely enough, not yet, but would, about a 6-year-old girl who needed walls higher than the ones in Queens, walls higher than this. She hadn't understood the weight of those words when he'd said them. She was beginning to now. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the kitchen. Nathaniel was alone. Lily at her new school, her first full day. He was at the counter with his leather notebook open, writing in that compact, precise hand. The cheap phone sat face down beside the notebook. A cup of tea, not coffee, she noted, never coffee, steamed at his elbow. He didn't look up when she entered, but she knew he'd heard her. She sat down across from him at the kitchen island. She waited until he looked up. "The watch," she said. His pen stopped moving. "I've been thinking about it since the first week," she continued, her voice controlled and precise. "You told me you don't need money, you won't touch the expense account. You wear your own watch. You said it was your father's. A Seiko, something sentimental." She held his gaze. "But last week, when we were standing under the chandelier in the front hall and the light hit it at the right angle, I saw the dial. Nathaniel, I know what a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime looks like. I have one in my safe. Mine cost $4.2 million. She paused. "The one on your wrist isn't a production model." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Nathaniel set down his pen. He looked at her across the island with those still, green, unclassifiable eyes. And for the first time since she had knocked on the door of apartment 3B, Chloe Sterling watched the mechanic disappear. It happened slowly, a millimeter at a time, like a tide going out. And what it revealed underneath was something that made the air in the room feel heavier and thinner simultaneously. "You're observant," he said. His voice had dropped an octave. The unhurried baritone was still there, but something beneath it had surfaced. Something with edges. "Who are you?" Chloe asked. Before he could answer, her phone rang. It was Davis. And his voice, when she answered, had the quality of someone running. The gala. Davis's call lasted 45 seconds, long enough to tell her that Richard Caldwell had accelerated his proxy campaign by acquiring another 3% of Sterling shares through a Cayman Islands intermediary that their legal team had somehow missed. Long enough to tell her that 3 board members, previously reliable, had taken private meetings with Caldwell's people over the weekend. Long enough to tell her that the Sterling annual charity gala, scheduled for Friday evening at the plaza, had just become the most strategically important social event of her professional life. "He'll be there," Davis said. "Caldwell. He accepted the open invitation. He's bringing his full executive team." "Of course he is," Chloe said. She hung up and looked at Nathaniel, who had closed his leather notebook and was watching her with the particular attentiveness of someone who has assessed a situation and is waiting for the relevant party to catch up. "Change of plans," she said. "Friday evening. Black tie. I need you ready by 7. "The gala," he said. "Not a question. Caldwell will be there. He's going to use the occasion to perform, to make the board see our marriage as a liability, a symptom of compromised judgment. He'll go after you specifically." She held his gaze. "I need you to be present, composed, and completely unremarkable. Don't engage him. Don't rise to anything he says. Just stand beside me and look like you belong there." Nathaniel considered this for a moment. "All right," he said. It was, she would reflect later, the most deceptive sentence she had ever heard spoken. She ordered him a suit on Wednesday. Her tailor, a Neapolitan named Gianluca, who operated a small appointment-only atelier on the Upper East Side and who had dressed 3 sitting senators and 1 European head of state, came to the penthouse with 4 bolts of cloth and a measuring tape and the professional composure of a man who had seen everything. He had not, Chloe suspected, seen Nathaniel cross. Gianluca measured in silence, made 2 small sounds that Chloe recognized as suppressed professional enthusiasm, and left with the cloth and a 48-hour deadline. The suit arrived Friday at 4 p.m. Charcoal wool, single-breasted, with a subtle structure through the chest and shoulders that required no padding, because the shoulders themselves required no assistance. Chloe was in the foyer when Nathaniel emerged from the East Wing at 6:45. She had prepared herself to feel nothing in particular. She was a woman who had attended 300 black tie events. She had stood beside heads of state and self-made billionaires, and once, memorably, a retired Formula One champion. She was not susceptible to superficial impression. She felt something in particular. It was not the suit, though the suit was exceptional. It was not the fact that he had, without instruction, slicked his dark hair back in a way that restructured his entire face, from roughly handsome to something more architectural. It was not the watch. The Patek Philippe, worn without apology, the prototype that cost more than most buildings, sitting on his wrist as naturally as if it had always been there. It was the way he stood. She had grown accustomed to the mechanic's posture, the slight forward lean, the contained energy, the bearing of someone who was making themselves deliberately smaller than they were. Standing in the foyer in Gianluca's charcoal wool, Nathaniel Cross was not making himself smaller. He was, in fact, exactly the size he actually was. And he was very, very large. "You look acceptable," Chloe said. "You look extraordinary," Nathaniel said with such complete straightforwardness that it landed before she could deflect it. She was wearing emerald silk, a column gown by a Vietnamese-American designer she had been championing for 2 years, caught on a bias that moved with her like water. Her mother's pearls at her throat, her hair swept up. She had looked at herself in the mirror before leaving her room and thought, clinically, this will do. Standing in front of Nathaniel Cross, she felt, for reasons she refused to examine, that the assessment had been insufficient. "Remember," she said, reaching for her wrap, "you don't need to speak. Stay close, don't engage Caldwell, and follow my lead." "Of course," Nathaniel said pleasantly. In the elevator, Lily's voice drifted from the East Wing. She was spending the evening with Andre, and a promised movie and a bowl of popcorn the size of her head, and had delivered her verdict on the evening's arrangements with the measured satisfaction of a child who understood she was getting the better deal. The Plaza Ballroom was everything money could buy and taste could arrange, crystal chandeliers casting the particular gold light that makes everyone present appear to be living in a memory. White orchids massed on every surface, a string quartet playing something European and melancholy in the corner. 400 people. Every one of them significant in some measurable way, and every one of them turning to look when Chloe Sterling walked in on the arm of her unexpected husband. The silence was brief and total, the kind that functions as the social equivalent of a held breath. Then it broke into something that sounded like conversation but was actually assessment. Chloe kept her chin at the precise angle she had perfected over 11 years of walking into rooms that didn't want her there. She felt Nathaniel's arm beneath her hand, steady, unhurried, radiating a body heat that was somehow grounding, and she moved through the crowd with the measured confidence of someone who owned the building, which, technically, she did. The Sterling Foundation had funded the plaza's renovation in 2019. She had the plaque to prove it. For 90 minutes, the evening proceeded according to her calculation. Board members were engaged and reassured. Institutional investors were charmed with careful precision. A senator she needed for an upcoming regulatory matter was handled with the diplomatic efficiency of a woman who understood that politics and corporate strategy were the same sport with different uniforms. Nathaniel moved beside her through all of it, saying little, observing everything, responding when addressed with a quiet competence that deflected further inquiry without appearing to. 3 different women found reasons to speak to him directly. He was polite to all of them and gave nothing away. Then Richard Caldwell crossed the room toward them. He was a handsome man in the way that money and confidence produce handsomeness. Silver at the temples, a custom tuxedo, a scotch in his hand that he held like a prop. He had the particular walk of someone who had never, in his adult life, entered a room without being watched, and had structured his entire personality around that fact. He looked at Chloe first, with the specific warmth of a man who wanted something from her and had decided that warmth was the efficient route. "Chloe!" He kissed the air beside her cheek. "You look devastating, as always." Then, with the studied casualness of a move he had planned since accepting the invitation, and this must be the famous Nathaniel, he turned to Nathaniel the way you turn to examine a piece of furniture someone has described as antique and which you have already assessed, from across the room, as reproduction. Nathaniel met his gaze. "Richard," Nathaniel said, just the name, nothing attached to it. Something registered in Caldwell's eyes. A flicker of recalibration, brief and quickly suppressed. Then the performance resumed. I have to say, I admire the romance of it, truly. The CEO and the mechanic. He smiled at the room as much as at them. There's something almost cinematic about it, isn't there? Very 21st century. The board must find it refreshing. He sipped his scotch. Tell me, Nathaniel, what is it you actually do all day now that you're living in a Central Park penthouse? I imagine the commute to the garage is somewhat different. The two executives behind Caldwell produced the expected sounds of amusement. Chloe felt the precise calibration required of this moment. She needed to respond, control the temperature, redirect, and began to move forward. Nathaniel's hand found the small of her back, one hand placed with such quiet authority that she stopped moving without deciding to. He stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough to establish a geometry that was no longer Caldwell's. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Richard," Nathaniel said. His voice was conversational, unhurried, pitched for 3 people and no further. "Your Q3 earnings report, the one filed through the Cayman structure 6 weeks ago." A pause, the length of a heartbeat. "Who signed off on the revenue recognition methodology? Was that internal or did you have outside counsel?" The scotch glass stopped moving halfway to Caldwell's mouth. "I only ask," Nathaniel continued, his voice dropping by precisely 1 register, "because the methodology appears inconsistent with the actual performance of your Pacific-facing subsidiaries in the same period, by roughly $41 million, which is interesting." His green eyes held Caldwell's with the specific, terrible patience of something that has already won and is simply waiting for the other party to understand it. The SEC's enforcement division tends to find that kind of inconsistency interesting as well. Caldwell had stopped breathing. Nathaniel reached out, took the scotch glass from Caldwell's unresisting hand, set it on a passing waiter's tray, and leaned in by 1 inch. "Stay away from my wife's company, Richard," he said softly. "And stay away from my wife." He stepped back, resumed his position beside Chloe, looked mildly at the hors d'oeuvres table as if considering the bruschetta. Caldwell left the ballroom 11 minutes later, abandoning his executives and his drink and his careful performance without ceremony or explanation. Chloe waited until they were in the elevator going up before she spoke. "That was not staying out of it," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "You knew about the Cayman filing." "Yes." "How?" The elevator opened onto the penthouse foyer. From the east wing came the sound of Lily's movie, something animated and triumphant. Nathaniel loosened his tie with 1 hand, the Patek Philippe catching the light as he did, and looked at her with those green, unclassifiable eyes. "Nathaniel," she said, "who are you?" He held her gaze for a long moment, and in that moment, for the first time with no evasion and no performance, she saw something in his face that was not the mechanic, not the ghost, not the careful construction of a man hiding inside ordinary life. She saw someone who was deciding to trust her. "Sit down," he said quietly. "There's something I need to tell you." "Fan Sao? Vanguard?" They sat in the library. Not the kitchen, not the open-plan living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its exposure to the city. The library. A room Chloe had furnished with intention and rarely used, lined with books she had read and books she intended to read, and 1 shelf of her mother's novels that she would never remove regardless of how many interior designers suggested the spines were the wrong color. It was the most private room in the penthouse. She wasn't sure why she led him there. Some instinct about what was coming suggested it deserved walls. She sat in the reading chair. He sat across from her on the small sofa, forearms resting on his knees, the Patek Philippe visible at his wrist. He hadn't removed his jacket. He looked like a man preparing to deliver a briefing. Organized, sequential, without affect. "My name is not Nathaniel Cross," he said. The sentence was quiet and absolute, like a foundation stone being set. "My name is Nathaniel Harrison Vanguard. I am 34 years old. I was born in London to an American father and a British mother, both of whom are dead." He paused, not for effect, but with the specific quality of someone navigating terrain that costs them something. "My father was a financial architect. He built sovereign debt instruments for emerging markets in the 90s, the kind of work that makes you very wealthy, and make certain people very angry when the instruments mature and the debts come due. Chloe said nothing. She was very still. I inherited his work at 22 when he died. I spent the next decade building on it, restructuring it, expanding it. He looked at the watch on his wrist for a moment, then back at her. NH Vanguard Holdings is a sovereign wealth fund. We manage approximately $4.3 trillion in assets across 61 jurisdictions. We hold significant debt positions in 11 G20 nations. We are the primary shadow creditor for 3 central banks that cannot publicly acknowledge the relationship. A pause. We are not listed. We have never been photographed. We do not attend conferences or issue press releases or appear on any register of financial institutions that is accessible to the public. Chloe heard the words. She processed them with the part of her brain that processed numbers and structures and the architecture of power. 4.3 trillion. The GDP of Germany. The kind of number that stopped being a number and became something closer to a physical law. The Forbes list, she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. The unnamed sources. There have been rumors for years about a shadow fund operating at sovereign scale. NH Vanguard. People in our industry treat it like a ghost story. People in your industry are correct, Nathaniel said. That's intentional. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because 3 years ago, he said, a Russian syndicate called the Sorokin Group decided that a sovereign debt I held on a restructured energy corridor agreement was inconvenient to their expansion plans. The debt was legitimate. The agreement was binding. They chose a different resolution mechanism. His jaw tightened by a fraction. They sent a team to our house in Connecticut on a Tuesday evening in October. I was in the city. My wife, Sarah, was not. The library was very quiet. She was driving back from our daughter's pediatric appointment. Nathaniel continued. His voice remained level but had become somehow entirely airless. The team ran her off the road on the Merritt Parkway. She died at the scene. Lily was in the car. He paused. Lily was not hurt. Physically. Chloe pressed her hand flat against her knee. The Sorokin Group's operating protocol when eliminating a financial adversary is to remove the principal and then remove the heir. It closes the debt position entirely. No succession claim, no legal challenge. He met her eyes. Lily was 6 months old. She was the heir. So you disappeared, Chloe said. I had 48 hours before they confirmed I hadn't been in the car. I used those 48 hours to construct Nathaniel Cross, entirely from scratch, built above the level at which standard intelligence services operate. I took Lily to Queens because Queens made sense. Density, anonymity, the kind of neighborhood where a single father working as a mechanic is invisible because everyone around him is too busy surviving to observe him. His voice was flat and factual, and underneath it was something that had been compressed by 3 years of pressure into something very small and very hard. Sebastian ran Vanguard from London. I directed operations through encrypted channels. We continued to grow, we continued to function, and I kept Lily alive. But the Sorokin Group was still looking. Always. Until 6 weeks ago when Sebastian tracked their primary cell to a logistics facility outside Gdańsk. We've since dismantled the relevant leadership. He paused. The threat is neutralized. Lily is safe, which means, technically, the operational justification for this arrangement has expired. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. Arthur, she said. He knew all of this. Arthur Sterling was my first mentor outside my father's world. I met him at 26 when I restructured a debt position that was about to destroy a company he loved. We've been in quiet contact ever since. Something shifted in his expression. The first genuinely warm thing she had seen on his face that wasn't directed at Lily. When the Sorokin Group began closing in on my location in Queens 18 months ago, Arthur offered me the most elegant solution available. The blinding spotlight of the most famous, most heavily secured, most relentlessly photographed female CEO in American business. He held her gaze. No one looks for the world's most powerful shadow financier in the east wing of Chloe Sterling's penthouse. The cover wasn't just good, it was perfect. He threatened to give the company to Caldwell, Chloe said, to force me to accept. Yes, because he knew I'd never agree otherwise. He knew you'd never agree otherwise, Nathaniel confirmed. And he knew something else. He paused. He told me when he proposed the arrangement that you had built an empire and forgotten to build anything around it. That you were the most capable person he had ever known and the most comprehensively alone. He looked at her steadily. He said he wasn't just giving me a place to hide, he was giving you something to come home to. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had a different weight, a different temperature. Chloe looked at the man sitting across from her. The man she had categorized and contracted and filed away as a temporary inconvenience. And felt the entire architecture of her assumptions shift beneath her like ground that has decided to become water. The Omnicorp reversal, she said finally. Victor Harrison had $40 million in undocumented gambling debt held through a Macau intermediary that NH Vanguard acquired 18 months ago as part of an unrelated portfolio restructuring. When Sebastian contacted him with our displeasure regarding his decision to exit your supply chain, he found the situation clarifying. The board members Caldwell has been meeting with. Their offshore positions are comprehensively documented. They'll be receiving letters this week from an anonymous legal firm. They'll return to your column before the next board session. And Caldwell himself? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Caldwell is a problem that is currently resolving itself, he said. His margin calls are significantly more precarious than his public filings suggest. He's been using personal leverage to fund the proxy campaign. When that leverage is called, and it will be called, and the timing of that call is not entirely outside my influence, he'll be too occupied with his own survival to concern himself with yours. Chloe absorbed this. She was, by training and temperament, a woman who processed information before responding to it. She took the facts she had been given, the scale of them, the precision of them, the way they rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 2 months, and she held them against the light and examined them the way she examined quarterly reports, looking not just at what was there, but at what it implied. What it implied was this. She had spent 2 months feeling vaguely unsettled in her own home by a man she had considered beneath her notice, while that man had been quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary competence, running the largest undisclosed financial operation in human history from her kitchen terrace. She had called him a broken carburetor. The memory was, in retrospect, spectacular. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "The threat is gone. You could have simply left, taken Lily, dissolved the arrangement, disappeared back into whatever existence NH Vanguard actually occupies." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "2 reasons," he said. "The first is that you were going to find out regardless. You're too intelligent and too relentless, and you've already spoken to Donovan Croft, which tells me you're 3 days away from pulling a thread that leads somewhere I'd prefer to control the reveal of. And the second reason," he was quiet for 4 full seconds, "the night you came home with the Omnicorp news," he said. "You sat at the kitchen island and accepted a bowl of soup, and you looked, for exactly 30 seconds, like a person who was genuinely tired and genuinely grateful for something warm." He paused. "I've been building walls for 3 years, Chloe. That 30 seconds was the first time I'd seen anything on the other side of mine." He held her gaze with absolute steadiness. "I thought you deserved to know who was on this side of them." The library held the silence between them. From the east wing, faintly, came the sound of Lily's movie ending. The triumphant swell of an animated score, designed to signal that everything had worked out, that the right people had found each other, that the world made sense. Chloe looked at Nathaniel Harrison Vanguard. He looked back at her. "Your soup," she said finally, "was very good." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the architecture of one, the suggestion of what a smile would look like on a face that had forgotten how to make them without calculation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Funbai?" Code red. 3 days passed after the library conversation. They were different days from the ones before them. Not warmer exactly, not easier, but more honest in their texture. The performance of distance that both of them had been maintaining, the careful orchestration of not quite meeting in the shared spaces of the penthouse, relaxed by some small but measurable degree, Not because anything had been resolved, because something had been named, and named things take up less energy than unnamed ones. Lily noticed immediately with the unerring social perception of a child who had spent 3 years reading her father's moods for safety information. "You and Daddy talked," she informed Chloe on Saturday morning, appearing at the West Wing doorway in her pajamas with her rabbit under one arm and a bowl of cereal she had poured herself, somewhat ambitiously, under the other. "We did," Chloe said, looking up from her laptop. "Was it a good talk or a quiet talk?" Chloe considered this taxonomy. "What's the difference?" "A good talk is when people say real things," Lily said, with the confidence of a child delivering received wisdom. "A quiet talk is when they say words but mean something else." She assessed Chloe with those green eyes, her father's eyes, wearing her father's expression of unsettling perceptiveness. "Daddy has a lot of quiet talks." "Does he?" "He used to. Less now." Lily looked down at her cereal bowl. "He smiles more here than he did in Queens. Real smiles, not the ones he does for other people." She looked back up. "I thought you should know that." She left with the authority of a child who has delivered the relevant information and considers the matter settled. Chloe sat for a moment, looking at the empty doorway. Then she returned to her laptop, because she was a woman who processed things in motion rather than stillness. And there was a board presentation to prepare. And she was not going to think about Lily's taxonomy of conversations, or the distinction between real smiles and performed ones, or the fact that she had been cataloging, without intending to, the specific quality of Nathaniel's expression on the rare occasions when Lily made him laugh. She was absolutely not thinking about that. Pannanithe. The call came on Tuesday at 8:14 a.m. Chloe was in the boardroom for a pre-market strategy session when her phone buzzed with Davis's ID. She let it go to voicemail. Davis knew not to call during sessions unless the building was on fire. It buzzed again immediately. She stepped out. "Caldwell's margin calls hit this morning," Davis said, and his voice had the flat, controlled urgency of someone managing their own panic with considerable effort. "All of them, simultaneously." His primary lender called the full position. Apparently there was a covenant trigger in the loan structure that nobody on his team caught. "He's functionally bankrupt as of 90 minutes ago." Chloe began. "That's not why I'm calling." Davis's voice dropped. "He's retained a private tactical firm. Eastern European, operates in the grey market, does corporate extraction work. We've seen this firm before. They were involved in the Meridian data breach in 2019. A pause. "They breached the Sterling Tower lobby 14 minutes ago. 4-man team, tactical gear, suppressed weapons. They bypassed our biometric entry system on the first attempt. Chloe, first attempt. That system cost $8 million. The boardroom behind her continued its muffled conversation, oblivious. "What do they want?" Chloe asked. Her voice was steady. 11 years of crisis management had given her a particular kind of calm that activated precisely when it was most needed. Not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid, but the calm of someone who had decided that fear was operationally inconvenient. "Our intelligence says they're after the Sterling financial ledger drives, the offshore documentation you keep in the penthouse safe. Caldwell needs leverage. Something to take to the DOJ as a bargaining chip." Davis exhaled. "But Chloe, there's a secondary objective. If they can't get the ledgers, they're authorized to take a hostage. Someone close to you. Someone that makes you compliant." The word hostage landed in Chloe's chest like something physical. "They're already in the elevator," Davis said. "Private shaft. I can't stop them from here. You need to get out of the building. Right now." "Lily is in the penthouse," Chloe said, a silence that lasted less than a second but contained a great deal. "Chloe!" She hung up. She was already moving. She took the emergency stairwell. 34 floors, and she ran them in heels without thinking about it because there was nothing to think about except the number 3B written on a door in Queens and a 6-year-old girl with a one-eared rabbit who had told her 3 days ago that her father smiled more here than he did before. She burst through the penthouse entrance to find Nathaniel already standing in the center of the foyer. He was facing the private elevator doors. He had his phone in one hand. The leather notebook was open on the console table behind him, a pen resting across it. He looked like a man who had been interrupted mid-thought and had set things down deliberately before turning to address the interruption. His expression was composed in a way that had nothing to do with calm, and everything to do with something running beneath calm, like a current beneath ice. "You know," Chloe said, "it wasn't a question. Sebastian flagged the breach 7 minutes ago." He looked at her. A quick, comprehensive assessment, the kind that takes a fraction of a second and misses nothing. "Where's Lily?" "East wing, her room." He moved past her toward the east wing with a speed that was at odds with his usual unhurried bearing, and she followed. Lily was at her desk working on a drawing, her rabbit beside her, headphones around her neck. She looked up when they came in, reading the room with immediate accuracy. "Is it the quiet game?" she asked. It was what he'd called it in Chloe's imagination of this scenario. She realized now that Lily already knew the protocol, had been taught it, had practiced it without Chloe ever being aware. The fact of it, the quiet, comprehensive preparation of a father who had been expecting this moment for 3 years, landed somewhere behind her sternum. "It's the quiet game," Nathaniel confirmed. His voice was completely even. "The big metal closet bug, take your rabbit." "Okay, Daddy." Lily gathered her rabbit and her current drawing with the focused efficiency of a child who understood that this was serious, and that seriousness required cooperation rather than questions. She looked at Chloe once. "You're coming too?" "Yes," Chloe said. "I'm coming too." The panic room was behind the library bookshelf. A reinforced steel chamber 8 feet by 10, with its own air supply and power source, and a viewport of bulletproof glass, the size of a paperback novel. Nathaniel had clearly identified it within his first week in the penthouse. Of course he had. He ushered them inside. Lily went to the small bench at the back, settled her rabbit on her knee, and looked at her drawing with the concentrated calm of a child who had been taught that stillness was a form of courage. Chloe turned at the doorway. "Come in," she said. "Nathaniel, come inside." He was facing away from her, toward the living room. His right hand had reached beneath the console table beside the bookshelf. A console table she had never examined closely, had never thought to examine closely, and emerged holding a matte black pistol with a suppressor already fitted. He held it with the specific, unhesitating familiarity of someone for whom it was not a dramatic object, but a functional one. Her mind catalogued this without quite believing it. "Lock the door," he said quietly. "Don't open it until I say Prometheus." "Nathaniel." "Prometheus," he repeated, meeting her eyes. In his face she saw something she hadn't expected. Not coldness, not the predator she'd glimpsed in fragments over the past weeks, but something more human than either. Something that looked, for one unguarded second, like the specific fear of a man who has already lost one person and is making very sure he doesn't lose another. "Lock the door, Chloe." She locked the door. "Yeah." Through the bulletproof viewport, the scene in the living room had the quality of something watched through the wrong end of a telescope. Slightly unreal, slightly too precise, the colors too sharp. The private elevator chimed. The brushed steel doors opened. 4 men in tactical black moved into the foyer with the compact, efficient choreography of professionals who had done this many times in many places. They had weapons raised before they'd cleared the elevator threshold. Nathaniel was standing in the center of the living room. He was not hiding. He was not taking cover. He was standing in the open in his white shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and the Patek Philippe on his wrist, watching 4 armed men pour into his home with the specific, evaluating stillness of someone who is not counting the threat but calculating the sequence. The first man raised his weapon. Nathaniel was already moving. What happened in the next 40 seconds was difficult to process through glass, at a distance with Lily's small warm weight leaning against her arm. Chloe watched it with the part of her mind that was always running, always recording, always filing. The part that did not allow itself to feel things until the operational moment had passed. He moved without hesitation and without waste. 2 shots, suppressed, barely audible through the reinforced door. And the first 2 men were down, incapacitated but alive, before they had completed raising their weapons. The remaining two opened fire, and Nathaniel was no longer where he had been, rolling behind the kitchen island with a fluency of movement that had no business existing in a man his size. It was not, Chloe realized, watching through the small rectangle of bulletproof glass, the movement of someone who had learned to fight. It was the movement of someone who had been built for it. 40 seconds after it began, all four men were on the floor. Nathaniel walked to the tactical leader, crouched beside him, pressed the suppressor, still radiating heat, against the man's neck, and asked a question she couldn't hear through the glass. The man answered. Whatever he said, it changed the quality of the air in the room. Even through the viewport, through the reinforced steel and the bulletproof glass and the sealed silence of the panic room, Chloe saw Nathaniel's posture shift. She had seen it before. On the terrace, in fragments. But she had never seen it at full scale and in full light. The mechanic was gone. What replaced him was something that the word dangerous was insufficient to describe. Then the terrace doors blew open. Phantom? Sebastian. 6 men came through the terrace doors simultaneously. Not through them. The doors had been removed from their frames with a precision that suggested the hinges had been pre-loosened. The glass panels lowered rather than shattered. The entry engineered to produce minimum noise and maximum control. The men who came through wore dark suits rather than tactical gear. Bespoke dark suits, Chloe noted, even through the bulletproof viewport, with the specific cut of a Savile Row house she recognized. And they moved through the wreckage of her living room with the economical authority of people for whom violence was an environment rather than an event. They secured the 4 mercenaries with zip restraints and professional efficiency. They checked corners. They communicated in gestures rather than words. They did all of this in under 90 seconds and then arranged themselves in a perimeter, around the room's perimeter, as if they had rehearsed the specific layout of this specific penthouse, which Chloe understood with a cold clarity they almost certainly had. A 7th man followed them through the terrace opening. He was taller than the others, late 50s, silver-haired, with the upright bearing of a man who had spent decades in rooms where posture was a statement of allegiance. He wore his suit with the ease of a second skin. He stepped over the displaced terrace door frame without looking down, crossed the living room floor without hurrying, and stopped in front of Nathaniel with a slight inclination of his head that was not quite a bow, but contained everything a bow contains. "Perimeter is secure, sir," he said. His voice carried even through the panic room glass. A precise British baritone, clipped and certain. "The building's security systems have been restored to your protocols. Local law enforcement response has been redirected. There'll be a gas leak reported on the block within the next 4 minutes, which should occupy them adequately." A pause. "The cleanup crew is 12 minutes out." "The leader," Nathaniel said, nodding toward the man on the floor. "What did he tell you?" "Consistent with what he told you. Caldwell's authorization. Primary objective, the ledger drives. Secondary objective..." The silver-haired man's gaze moved briefly to the panic room door, and something in his expression tightened by a fraction. Secondary objective was the child. The room was very quiet. "All right," Nathaniel said. 2 words carrying the specific weight of a decision being made and filed and acted upon simultaneously. He walked to the panic room and tapped twice on the glass with 1 knuckle. "Prometheus," he said. "Annie." Chloe opened the door. She stepped out with Lily's hand in hers. Lily, who had spent the last 40 seconds with her face pressed against Chloe's ribs and her rabbit pressed against her face, not making a sound, performing her courage with a completeness that made something in Chloe's chest ache, with a specificity she hadn't anticipated and couldn't immediately categorize. The silver-haired, Sarad man stepped forward immediately, crouching to Lily's eye level with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, reduced himself, gentled himself, become available rather than imposing. "Hello, Miss Lily," he said. "My name is Sebastian. I work for your father. We've spoken on the phone, but I don't believe we've met properly." Lily studied him with her green eyes. "You have a nice voice," she said. "That's very kind of you to say. Are you British?" "I am." "My rabbit is called Edmund," Lily said. "He's also very brave." "I can see that," Sebastian said gravely. Would Edmund like to come and see the helicopter on the roof? We have a very large one. It has leather seats. Lily looked up at Nathaniel. He nodded. She looked at Chloe. And this, Chloe would think about later. The fact that the child looked at both of them in sequence, treating the permission structure as bilateral rather than singular, as if she had already rearranged her understanding of who constituted authority in her life. Okay, Lily said. She took Sebastian's offered hand, then she turned back. Chloe, she said with great seriousness, your floor is going to need a mop. I'll handle it, Chloe said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went with Sebastian toward the service elevator, Edmund under her arm, with the focused composure of a 6-year-old who had decided that this was an adventure and that adventures were better navigated with dignity. Well, sir. Chloe turned to face the room. The living room looked like a location that had been used for a specific purpose and was now in the process of being returned to its prior state. 2 of Sebastian's men were already moving the incapacitated mercenaries toward the service entrance, with the methodical efficiency of a removal service. A third was replacing the terrace doors. Apparently the hinges had not, in fact, been pre-loosened, they had simply been removed and were now being reattached. The fourth was photographing something on the floor that Chloe decided not to look at directly. The Cy Twombly canvas above the fireplace had taken a bullet. The frame had absorbed most of it, but the canvas itself was gone in one corner. The paint fractured outward in a pale starburst. Chloe looked at it for a moment. I never liked that piece, she said. No? Nathaniel was standing beside her, his pistol holstered. Holstered, she noted, in a shoulder rig beneath his jacket, which meant he had been wearing it at the gala, at every public appearance. In the kitchen every morning, in the elevator, everywhere. And she had never once detected it. My CFO gave it to me when we hit $1 billion in revenue. He thought it was appropriate. I thought it looked like someone had sneezed on an expensive canvas. She paused. I can bill Caldwell for it. You can bill Caldwell for considerably more than that, Nathaniel said. Satse. The boardroom of Sterling Global at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday held a different quality of silence from its usual silence. Its usual silence was the silence of power in repose, contained, purposeful, waiting to be activated. This silence was something else. This was the silence of a room that understood something irreversible was about to happen inside it. Richard Caldwell was already there when they arrived. Sebastian's team had collected him from his Upper East Side townhouse 40 minutes earlier, a process that had apparently involved very little persuasion and a great deal of cooperation from a man who had, by that point, received a preliminary communication from his primary lender, a call from his attorney about an SEC inquiry that had materialized from nowhere that morning, and a visit from 2 federal agents who had asked questions about a shell company in Belize that he had believed to be comprehensively undiscoverable. He sat at the far end of the mahogany table in a suit he had not chosen for the occasion, his hands folded in front of him, his face carrying the particular grey pallor of a man who has spent the last 2 hours understanding the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually is. Chloe entered first. She had gone home, changed into a charcoal Armani suit of almost architectural severity, and repaired everything about her appearance that the morning had disrupted. She walked to the head of the table with a deliberateness that used the full length of the room, letting every step count, letting Caldwell watch her approach with the time to understand what it meant. She sat. Nathaniel entered behind her and did not sit. He had changed as well. A navy 3-piece suit, the Patek Philippe at his wrist, his dark hair returned to its natural fall. He looked, Chloe thought, exactly like what he was. A man who had stopped pretending to be smaller than his actual size. He walked the length of the table slowly, stopping behind Caldwell's chair. He didn't touch the chair. He simply stood behind it, and the quality of his presence in that position, the specific atmospheric weight of a man of his particular nature standing directly behind you, was apparently sufficient. Caldwell was sweating. Richard, Chloe said. Her voice was even and unhurried and contained everything she needed it to contain. I want to be efficient with your time because you have a great deal happening today, and I understand the schedule is full. She opened the leather folder in front of her. As of this morning, NAH Vanguard Holdings has acquired the controlling debt position in Caldwell Capital Partners through 3 separate creditor transactions completed between 6 and 8 a.m. Your primary lender, your secondary facility, and your revolving credit line are all now held through intermediaries by a single beneficial owner. Caldwell's eyes moved to the man standing behind him. Your proxy share campaign against Sterling Global, Chloe continued, has been suspended by court order. A filing we made at 7:45 this morning based on documentary evidence of fraudulent proxy solicitation. The evidence was comprehensive and has already been reviewed by a federal judge. She turned a page. Your Q3 earnings misstatement in the Cayman structure has been referred to the SEC's Enforcement Division. This referral was made by an anonymous party whose documentation was, I'm told, impeccably organized. I'll cooperate, Caldwell said. His voice had the quality of something that had been hollowed out. Whatever you want. I'll sign the shares back. I'll withdraw the proxy campaign. Whatever you need, Chloe. Whatever you need. I need you to understand something, Richard. Chloe leaned forward very slightly. This is not a negotiation. You do not have anything left to negotiate with. What I am describing to you is not a set of conditions. It is a description of what has already happened. She paused. You sent armed men into a building where a 6-year-old child was present. You authorized, in writing, which was a remarkable error in judgment, a contingency that involved taking that child. That is not a corporate matter. That is a federal criminal matter. And the documentation of your authorization is currently in the hands of people whose job it is to act on it. Caldwell had stopped trying to speak. Nathaniel leaned down slowly, bringing his face level with Caldwell's ear, and said something that Chloe could not hear. Whatever it was, it lasted 4 seconds. Caldwell closed his eyes. The FBI is currently in your offices on the 41st floor, Nathaniel said, straightening. He checked his watch with the calm of a man consulting a train schedule. They've been there for 22 minutes. Based on the documentation they have, you have approximately 6 minutes before they come up here. He walked to the door and held it open. I suggest you use the time to call your attorney. A good one, not the one who signed off on the Cayman structure. He has his own problems this morning. Sebastian appeared in the doorway, nodded to 2 figures in dark suits behind him, and Caldwell was escorted from the room with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything Sebastian organized. The doors closed. The boardroom was empty except for the 2 of them. Chloe leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling, at the recessed lighting and the architectural precision of a room she had fought for and nearly lost, and exhaled a breath that had been accumulating since 8:14 that morning. Your Cy Twombly, Nathaniel said, sitting down beside her rather than across from her. The first time she noticed that he had chosen proximity over professional distance in a room that was hers. I'll have it restored. There's a conservator in Florence who handles that kind of damage. He's very good. You know a conservator in Florence? I know people in most places. I imagine you do. She looked at him. Nathaniel. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. Simply and without qualification, in the way that people say things when they have decided that precision matters more than protection. He held her gaze for a moment. You're welcome, he said, with the same simplicity, the same absence of performance. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued its indifferent, magnificent business. 34 floors below, in a city of 8 million people, nobody knew what had just shifted in the room above them. But it had shifted, comprehensively and permanently. Fanchin, the prenup. They stayed in the boardroom for a long time after Caldwell left. Not because there was more business to conduct. The business was done comprehensively and permanently in the way that certain things are done when the right amount of force meets the right amount of preparation at exactly the right moment. They stayed because neither of them moved toward the door, and neither of them remarked on not moving. And the city outside the windows continued its indifferent rotation through late morning into early afternoon, while the 2 of them sat in the particular quiet of people who have been through something together and are not yet ready to return to the world that exists outside of it. Chloe had her leather folder open in front of her but wasn't reading it. Nathaniel had his forearms on the table, his hands loose, the Patek Philippe catching the pale November light from the windows. He was looking at the table surface with the focused internal expression of a man working through something that had no columns and no projections and no precedent in any document he had ever prepared. "Tell me about Sarah," Chloe said. She hadn't planned to say it. The words arrived from somewhere beneath planning, from the region of herself that had been paying attention to things she hadn't consciously authorized herself to pay attention to. The closed casket he had mentioned in the library, the way his voice had gone airless around her name, the specific quality of his grief, which was not performed and not suppressed but carried, the way people carry things they have decided they will carry forever, because putting them down feels like a second abandonment. He was quiet for a moment. She was a marine architect, he said. She designed racing hulls, carbon fiber, high-performance offshore racing. She was extraordinarily good at it. A pause. She was also completely unimpressed by money, which was the most disorienting thing I had ever encountered in another person at that point in my life. I could have bought her anything. She wanted to go kayaking in Maine and eat lobster rolls on a dock and read paperback novels until she fell asleep. Something shifted in his face. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but the particular expression of someone remembering joy and being surprised by how intact it remains. She would have found the last 2 months very amusing. The mechanic cover, the entire thing. She had a very precise sense of humor, very dry. She would have watched you walk into that apartment in your Louboutins, and she would have said, he stopped, almost smiled. She would have said something that I'm not going to repeat because it would have been accurate and unkind, and she would have delivered it with complete affection. Chloe looked at him. She sounds remarkable. She was, he said, simple and final and carrying no performance. Lily has her eyes, her instincts, her complete inability to be intimidated by anyone. He glanced toward the window. When Lily told you that you looked like the lady on the building, that was Sarah. Exactly. No filter, no calculation, just the true thing stated plainly. She's extraordinary, Chloe said. Lily? I know. He said it with the specific gravity of a parent who has understood every day for 6 years that the most important thing in their life fits under one arm and calls the stuffed rabbit Edmund. She asked me last week whether you were going to stay. Chloe went still. What did you tell her? I told her that was a question I couldn't answer for you. He met her eyes. She said that was a very grown-up way of saying I didn't know. She was right. She usually is. Sir. Nathaniel reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between them. The prenuptial agreement, or rather, what remained of it. He had been carrying it since the library, she realized. 52 pages, folded into quarters, slightly creased from 3 days in a pocket. He set it on the mahogany surface with the deliberateness of someone placing something significant rather than discarding something irrelevant. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. The Sorokin Group is dismantled, he said. The operational justification for this arrangement expired when Sebastian confirmed their leadership structure had been neutralized. By the terms of the contract, either party may withdraw at this point without financial penalty. He looked up at her. You get the shares. Arthur transfers them immediately. He's been waiting for the threat to resolve before making the transfer. Sterling Global is yours. Uncontested. Fully protected. A pause. And Lily and I can return to whatever life looks like now that we don't have to hide inside someone else's. Chloe looked at the folded document. Is that what you want? She asked. I'm telling you what the contract provides. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality from his usual silences, less contained, less managed, closer to the surface of something. No, he said. It isn't what I want. She held his gaze. Then say what you want, Nathaniel. Not what the contract provides. Not what's operationally justified. Not what the situation permits. She kept her voice level and her eyes on his. You told me that you've been building walls for 3 years. I've been building them for considerably longer. I'm tired of the architecture. A pause. Say the true thing. Plainly. He looked at her for a long moment. The green eyes that had unsettled her from the first doorway, that she had filed and assessed and catalogued and never quite managed to classify because they didn't fit any category she had established for people who stood in her vicinity. Then he picked up the prenuptial agreement. He tore it in half with a single clean movement. Not dramatically, not slowly for effect, but with the same directness he applied to everything, the straightforward acknowledgement of a decision already made. He set both halves on the table. "I want to stay," he said, not because of the operational logic, not because the cover is still useful or the arrangement is efficient or any other reason that belongs in a document. He held her gaze steadily. "I want to stay because this penthouse has been the first place in 3 years that has felt like something other than a position. Because Lily draws rabbits on your wallpaper and you don't say anything about it. Because you came home with a migraine and a $340 million problem and you sat at the kitchen island and ate soup and looked for 30 seconds like a person rather than a performance." He paused. "And because when Davis called this morning and told you there were armed men in your building, the first thing you said, before logistics, before planning, before anything, was that Lily was in the penthouse." Chloe felt something move in her chest that had no financial equivalent and no column in any report she had ever prepared. "You heard that. I was already in the foyer. Yes." She looked at the two halves of the prenuptial agreement on the table between them. 52 pages of careful legal architecture designed to maintain distance, to codify the absence of something, to structure a space where two people could exist in proximity without the risk of adjacency. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her with a slight surprise, the first time she had seen genuine surprise on his face. "For what?" "The carburetor comment," she said. "The first night in the kitchen, I told you that corporate politics wasn't a broken carburetor, that you wouldn't understand." She held his gaze. "It was condescending and it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I said it, which makes it worse." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "You also called me a charity case. In the car on the way to Queens. I wasn't there, but Davis told me." "Davis told you?" "Davis tells me a great deal. We've developed a rapport." Of course they had. Of course, the world's most powerful undisclosed financier had developed a rapport with her head of security over the past 2 months, while she had been treating him like a piece of furniture she'd agreed to store. "I was afraid of you," she said. "Not of you specifically. Of what you represented. Evidence that I had a blind spot. That something had been arranged around me that I hadn't seen. I don't accept blind spots gracefully." "No," he agreed, without unkindness. "You don't. I'm working on it." "I know," he said. "I've been watching." The boardroom was very quiet. The city outside the windows moved through its Tuesday afternoon with magnificent indifference. 34 floors below, 8 million people went about the business of their lives in complete unawareness that 2 people in a glass room above them were carefully, tentatively, and with the specific caution of people who had both lost things they hadn't expected to lose, dismantling the last of the careful structures they had built around themselves. Nathaniel stood. He moved around the table to where she sat, not quickly, not with the decisive momentum of a scene that knows it's a scene, but with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, as if he had all the time available and intended to use it correctly. He stopped beside her chair. She looked up at him. "I told you in the library," he said quietly, "that I married you because it was a strategic imperative." He reached out, and his calloused hand, the hand that had fixed engines and held Lily and operated from the shadows of global finance and this morning, had dismantled 4 armed men with the efficiency of something that had been built for it, rested against her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with all of those things and somehow contained all of them. "That was the reason I married you," he said. "It is not the reason I want to stay married to you." She stood. She was a woman who had spent 11 years being the most competent person in any room she entered. She had negotiated with sovereign funds and congressional committees and one genuinely terrifying Japanese conglomerate that had made 3 other CEOs cry. She did not, as a professional matter, find herself without a response. She found herself without a response. So she did something she had not done in longer than she could accurately calculate. She stopped constructing one. She let the silence be what it was, which was not empty but full, and she looked at the man in front of her who had been, in sequence, a charity case and a ghost and a mechanic and the apex predator of global finance, and a father on the floor drawing rabbits in pajamas. And she understood that all of those things were true simultaneously, and that the specific combination of them was something she did not have a category for because she had never encountered it before. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. "Then stay," she said. When he kissed her, it was not a transaction, it was not a merger or an acquisition or a strategic alliance or any of the other vocabularies she had available for the joining of significant things. It was something that belonged to a different register entirely, quieter than power and more durable than strategy, and significantly more disorienting than anything Richard Caldwell had managed to throw at her in 3 years of trying. She held onto the lapels of his navy suit, and he held onto her like someone who has been navigating by instruments in the dark for a very long time and has finally, unexpectedly, found something solid enough to orient by. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued. Neither of them noticed. Part 10. Empire. 6 months is not a long time in the life of an empire. It is, however, sufficient time to understand whether the foundations are real. Sterling Global's Q2 earnings report, released on a Thursday morning in late April, transmitted simultaneously to the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, and 17 financial wire services, contained numbers that caused 3 separate analysts to call their editors before publishing, wanting confirmation that the figures were not typographical errors. They were not typographical errors. Revenue was up 340%. The Pacific supply chain restructured under a new framework that nobody in the industry had seen before. A hybrid sovereign commercial architecture that the Financial Times described as either the most sophisticated logistics innovation of the decade or evidence that someone at Sterling Global has access to financial instruments that don't officially exist, was operating at a margin that made their nearest competitor look like a hobby. 6 new international agreements had been signed in the preceding quarter in markets where Sterling Global had previously been unable to gain traction, with counterparties who had inexplicably become suddenly enthusiastic about doing business with them. The board of directors, which had 3 months earlier been quietly entertaining Richard Caldwell's overtures, was now unanimously, vocally, and in several cases, embarrassingly enthusiastic in its support of Chloe Sterling's leadership. Richard Caldwell himself was awaiting trial on 7 federal counts and had been replaced in the financial press by people who had not committed fraud, which was a low bar but one he had nonetheless failed to clear. Arthur Sterling, watching the earnings numbers from his dimly lit study on the 40th floor, turned off the Bloomberg terminal, set down his oxygen mask, and permitted himself a smile of approximately 4 seconds duration before resuming his habitual expression of dissatisfied scrutiny. He had known, of course. He had known from the beginning. Had known when he made the call, had known when he drew up the papers, had known when he issued the ultimatum that his granddaughter would receive with fury and comply with because she was, underneath the armor, a person who understood that some things matter more than pride. He had known because he had spent 81 years studying people and he had met very few who were genuinely exceptional, and 2 of them were currently running a combined financial entity that was, by his conservative estimate, the single most powerful private economic force on the planet. He had also known because Jonathan Cross, 26 years ago on a burning road in California, had pulled him from a car with his bare hands and said, without looking for acknowledgement or reward, any decent man would have done the same. And Arthur Sterling had understood in that moment that decency at that scale was genetic and that a son raised by a man like Jonathan Cross would be, whatever else he became, someone worth knowing. He had been right. He was, in his experience, usually right. He picked up the oxygen mask, took a breath, set it down again, and reached for the phone to call his granddaughter. The penthouse on Central Park West had changed in 6 months. Not structurally. The marble was still marble, the floor-to-ceiling windows still framed their impossible view, the kitchen was still the kitchen where all significant things seemed to happen. But the atmosphere of the place had shifted in ways that were not architectural and not decorative and not anything that could be specified in an interior design brief. It had, without announcement or intention, become inhabited. Lily's drawings covered one full wall of the library. Not taped haphazardly but framed, in simple white frames that Nathaniel had measured and hung with the same precision he applied to everything. So that the gallery of rabbit kingdoms and castle ecosystems and one very ambitious depiction of the Manhattan skyline, populated entirely by animals in business attire, occupied the wall with the dignity of an actual collection, which Chloe had decided it was. The kitchen smelled, on most mornings, of whatever Nathaniel was making. He had, somewhere in the preceding months, displaced Andre from the breakfast shift entirely, not by design, but by the simple logic of a man who woke at 5 and found cooking meditative and was, it turned out, genuinely exceptional at it. Andre, who was French and professionally territorial, had adapted to this arrangement with surprising grace, possibly because Nathaniel had once, without comment, corrected a flaw in his beurre blanc technique that Andre had been unaware of for 11 years. Chloe had started coming home before 9. This was, for people who had worked with her for any length of time, the most startling development of the preceding 6 months. More startling even than the earnings figures, or the Caldwell verdict, or the unprecedented supply chain architecture. Chloe Sterling, who had treated her penthouse as a place to sleep between working hours, had begun to treat it as a place to be. Marcus Webb had noted this in a conversation with his wife and described it as, honestly, a little alarming, but in a good way, I think. Well, the boardroom filled at 9 a.m. on the last Thursday of April. 22 executives. Sterling Global's full senior leadership, expanded by the integration of NH Vanguard's operational advisory team, 3 of whom were present in person for the first time and all of whom turned out to be, beneath the organizational mystique, people who drank too much coffee and had opinions about conference room temperature. The presentation screens displayed the Q2 numbers in the clean, unambiguous language of verified fact. Chloe stood at the head of the table. She had prepared the presentation herself, not because she lacked people to prepare it for her, but because these numbers were hers in a way that felt important to honor with her own work. She knew every figure, every trend line, every implication. She had lived inside these numbers for 6 months, and she understood them the way she understood very few things, completely, from the inside. She was midway through the Pacific infrastructure segment when the boardroom doors opened. The room looked up. Nathaniel came in carrying Lily on his left shoulder, one large hand steadying her ankles with the practiced ease of a man who has made this particular structural choice many times and has calculated the weight distribution. Lily was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, her own selection purchased after a very serious conversation about what was appropriate for an important meeting, which had concluded with the blazer and the negotiated addition of small rabbit-shaped cufflinks that Nathaniel had found somewhere Chloe had decided not to ask about. She was holding Edmund under one arm and a manila folder under the other. The folder contained, Chloe knew, Lily's own quarterly report, a document she had prepared at the kitchen table over the preceding week with considerable focus and her father's assistance, covering the performance of her imaginary rabbit-based investment portfolio, which had, according to Lily's figures, significantly outperformed the market through strategic allocation in what she described as carrot futures. "Sorry," Nathaniel said in the tone of a man who is not particularly sorry. "Traffic on the stairs." "There's an elevator," Marcus Webb said. "Lily preferred the stairs," Nathaniel said, as if this were a complete and sufficient explanation. He set Lily down in the chair to Chloe's left. The chair that had been empty at every previous board meeting and which had, in the preceding month, developed an informal designation that nobody had articulated but everyone understood. He sat to Chloe's right. Lily arranged Edmund on the table in front of her, with the focused attention of someone establishing a professional presence, opened her manila folder and looked around the table with her father's green eyes and her mother's complete imperviousness to the weight of a room. "I have a report," she announced. "We'll get to that," Chloe said. "It's very good," Lily said, with the confidence of someone who has reviewed the figures and found them satisfactory. I don't doubt it, Chloe said. After mine. Lily considered this sequencing and found it acceptable, nodding with the measured grace of someone making a professional concession. 22 executives looked at the child, then at the man beside Chloe, then at Chloe herself, and the room contained, briefly, collectively, in the way that rooms sometimes contain things that aren't on the agenda, something that wasn't in any quarterly report and didn't appear on any earnings projection, but was, in its way, the most significant development of the preceding 6 months. Chloe looked at the screens, at the numbers that represented 11 years of her life compressed into verified fact. She looked at Nathaniel, who was reading Lily's quarterly report with an expression of focused, genuine interest. She looked at Lily, who was whispering something to Edmund about carrot futures with the seriousness of someone conducting a pre-meeting briefing. She thought about a boardroom 34 floors above Manhattan, where she had spent a decade being the most capable, most armored, most comprehensively defended version of herself. Building walls, as Nathaniel had put it, until the walls were the whole architecture and there was no room left inside them for anything that wasn't the empire. She thought about a crumbling brick building in Queens and a door that opened in 4 seconds and green eyes that didn't flinch. She thought about soup. She pressed the button to advance the presentation to the next slide. The Pacific restructuring generated a net margin improvement of 23.4% over the prior year, she said, her voice carrying the clean authority of someone entirely at home in her own life, which represents the highest quarterly margin in Sterling Global's operating history. She paused. We are going to discuss how we build on this, what the next 18 months look like, and what we're prepared to do to ensure that what we've built here is permanent. She looked around the room. We have an empire to run. Let's begin.
Serenity.
Later, after the meeting, after the analysts and the congratulations, and the inevitable 3 follow-up calls that every board session generated, regardless of how clearly things had been resolved, they walked home. Not in the Maybach, on foot, through Central Park, because it was late April, and the park was doing what it does in late April, which is remind everyone who passes through it that the world contains things that have nothing to do with quarterly earnings and everything to do with the fact of being alive in a particular place at a particular moment. Lily walked between them, holding one hand each, occasionally lifting her feet to be swung, which they did without discussion or coordination, as people do things they have done enough times to no longer require planning. Daddy, Lily said, watching a dog attempt to retrieve a stick from a fountain with maximum ambition and minimum success. Are we going to live in the shiny penthouse forever? Nathaniel looked at Chloe over Lily's head. Chloe looked back at him. At the green eyes she had once tried to classify and had given up classifying because they were simply his, specific and uncontainable, and by now, in the way of things that have become familiar, as legible to her as her own reflection. Yes, Chloe said, I think we are. Lily absorbed this. Good, she said. Edmund likes the view. She pulled them both forward toward the fountain and the dog and the late April light coming through the new leaves of the trees, and they went, without resistance, without calculation, without any of the careful architecture of distance they had each spent years constructing and months dismantling, into whatever came next. Which was not, as it turned out, an empire. An empire was what they ran. What they walked into on a Thursday afternoon in April with a 6-year-old between them and a rabbit under her arm was something smaller and more durable and considerably harder to build. It was home.